in the heart of a bustling police station, where authority echoes off concrete walls and fluorescent lights cast long, sterile shadows. The rhythm of power beats steadily. Phones ring in sharp bursts, their sounds swallowed by the heavy footsteps of officers moving with purpose. Voices rise and fall in clipped tones, routine commands, brief exchanges, the language of control spoken fluently within these walls. The walls themselves seem to hum with an unspoken authority, lined with faded posters, official notices and plaques meant to remind everyone of law and order. But amidst this orchestrated chaos, something feels different. There, standing in stark contrast to the towering adults around him, is a 6-year-old black boy. His small frame seems almost swallowed by the space, yet he radiates a quiet strength that pulls the eye, a stillness in the storm. His eyes, wide, observant, and filled with something far older than his years, scan the room. They're not filled with fear, but with a heavy curiosity, the kind that comes from seeing more than a child ever should. The camera moves slowly, tracking the indifferent faces of officers, some buried in paperwork, others laughing in hushed tones over private jokes. Badges glint under harsh lights, polished shoes click against the linoleum floor. The hum of the station is constant, like a machine that never pauses until it does. The boy stands there, gripping the hem of his shirt, his knuckles white. His gaze locks onto a white police officer nearby, a man whose face wears the confidence of unchecked power, eyes sharp with arrogance, a thin smirk playing on his lips as he exchanges dismissive glances with his colleagues. His posture is relaxed, casual even, the body language of someone who's never been questioned, someone who believes the uniform grants him immunity from accountability. And then it happens. A voice cuts through the noise, small but piercing, slicing cleanly through the heavy air. "That's not the truth." The words hang there, fragile yet unbreakable, like a thread pulling at the very fabric of the room. In an instant, everything stops. Conversations freeze mid-sentence. Officers pause mid-stride. Pens hover above paperwork, phones dangle in mid-air, forgotten for a moment. The mundane rhythm of the station collapses into a stunned silence, as if the walls themselves are holding their breath. All eyes shift. The camera lingers on faces, officers whose expressions shift from annoyance to confusion. Some raising their brows, others narrowing their eyes, trying to process what they've just heard. A child's voice, in this place, challenging what's been spoken as fact. The officer, the one whose arrogance seemed untouchable just seconds ago, turns slowly, his face tightening. The smirk is gone. His eyes darken, narrowing into slits, but not with fear. No, with something else. Something closer to disbelief, maybe even anger. He's not used to being challenged, certainly not by someone so young, so small, so unafraid. The boy's face is calm, his chin slightly lifted. There's no trembling in his voice, no hesitation in his eyes. He's not here to argue. He's not here to fight. He's just here to tell the truth. And sometimes that's the most powerful rebellion of all. A voiceover begins, soft but steady, layering over the charged silence. In a place where truth is often hidden behind badges and authority, one small voice dared to speak out, and his words shook the walls of the very system meant to protect us. The camera pulls back slightly, capturing the scene in full now, the boy standing like an anchor in the middle of the room, surrounded by uniforms, by power, by history. The stark contrast is undeniable. One child, one truth, and an entire system caught off guard. The silence lingers just a moment longer, thick with tension, before the screen slowly fades to black, leaving only the echo of his words in the minds of everyone watching. That's not the truth. And with that, the story begins. The scene shifts from the sterile walls of the police station to a different world, one filled with warmth, love, and lessons woven into the fabric of everyday life. The camera pans across a modest home, its walls adorned with family photos, school drawings, and small reminders of a life built on resilience. In the center of it all is the boy, surrounded by the gentle chaos of childhood, colorful toys scattered on the floor, books with dog-eared pages stacked on a small table, and the comforting hum of a family that holds him close. The lighting here is softer, golden, casting a warm glow that contrasts sharply with the cold, fluorescent lights of the station. It's a sanctuary, not just from the outside world, but from the harsh truths that often lie just beyond the front door. Flashbacks unfold like fragments of memory. The boy's mother, strong yet tender, kneels beside him, her hands gently resting on his small shoulders. Her eyes, filled with both love and worry, meet his as she speaks words that will echo through his heart long after this day. Always tell the truth, even when it's hard. Her voice is steady, not just teaching a lesson, but instilling a belief that truth matters, that words have power even when they tremble. His father's lessons come not just in words, but in actions. The boy watches him fix a broken chair, his hands rough from work, his face lined with quiet determination. Courage isn't about being the loudest, his father says one evening, as they sit on the porch under a sky sprinkled with stars. It's about standing tall when you're scared, about speaking up when it's easier to stay quiet. These words sink deep, like seeds planted in rich soil, waiting for the right moment to bloom. The boy's world is small, but full, a tight-knit neighborhood where laughter echoes down cracked sidewalks, and neighbors greet each other with nods and knowing smiles. But woven into this tapestry of community is an undercurrent, subtle, yet ever-present, the silent weight of fear, the unspoken rules about where to go, how to act, and most importantly, when to stay silent. The camera shifts, showing scenes of the neighborhood, children playing tag under the watchful eyes of parents who glance nervously whenever a police cruiser rolls by, conversations that trail off when uniforms are near, and the quiet tension that simmers beneath smiles. There's a shared understanding here, a collective memory of stories that never made the news, of names that were whispered but never written down. Now, the focus turns to the officer. His world is different, cold, calculated, wrapped in the comfort of authority. Flashbacks reveal his path, paved with promotions and commendations, his name etched on plaques that hang proudly in the precinct. But beneath the surface lies a history carefully tucked away, hidden behind the badge. Reports of misconduct filed and forgotten, complaints dismissed with a shrug, and a reputation built not on respect, but fear. The officer moves through his world with the ease of someone who has rarely been questioned. His authority is a shield, his uniform a mask. In scenes that flicker like distant memories, we see him in action. Interactions marked by subtle biases, words laced with disdain, and decisions that ripple through the lives of those he's sworn to protect. His arrogance isn't loud. It's in the way he dismisses voices that challenge him, the way he expects compliance without question. The contrast between these two lives is stark. The boy, raised in a home where truth is sacred, where courage is defined by the willingness to stand up even when your voice shakes. The officer, shaped by a system that rewards silence, that confuses authority with infallibility, and that fears the very truth the boy was taught to cherish. Interwoven with these personal stories is the broader backdrop of the community, a place marked by invisible lines drawn long before the boy was born. The strained relationship with law enforcement is palpable in every hesitant glance, every door that closes a little too quickly when patrol cars drive by. It's in the whispered warnings from elders to the young. Be careful. Don't give them a reason. It's a history not written in textbooks, but passed down through hushed conversations and lived experiences. As the flashbacks fade, the scene returns to the boy, now standing in that police station. His small figure, once cradled in the warmth of his family's lessons, now faces the cold reality of a system that wasn't built to listen to voices like his. But he speaks anyway, because somewhere deep inside, his mother's voice echoes, "Always tell the truth, even when it's hard." And for the boy, that truth has never been clearer. The fluorescent lights in the police station cast a harsh, sterile glow over the room, reflecting off polished floors and worn badges. The air feels heavy, dense with an authority that silences more than it protects. The station hums with its usual rhythm, phones ringing, officers exchanging clipped words, and the occasional shuffle of papers. But in the center of this controlled chaos stands a family, small in number but carrying a weight that fills the space around them. A black family, weary from an encounter that should have never escalated to this point, sits across from a white police officer whose authority drips from every word he speaks. His questions come sharp, like blades hidden behind a thin veil of professionalism. His tone is steeped in condescension, a false politeness masking an undercurrent of aggression. Every question isn't meant to seek truth, but to trap, to twist, to manipulate. The mother's hands tremble slightly as she grips her purse, her voice firm but edged with fear as she tries to explain what happened. The father sits rigid, jaw clenched, knowing that too much emotion could be used against him. Their crime? Existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their mistake? Believing they could explain themselves without being reduced to suspects. And then there's the boy. 6 years old, small in stature but with eyes too wide, too knowing for someone his age. He stands slightly behind his mother, clutching the hem of her coat, his small fingers twisting the fabric into knots. His gaze darts from his parents to the officer, watching, absorbing, confused by the injustice unraveling in front of him. The officer's words grow sharper, his accusations more elaborate. He spins a narrative crafted from thin air, painting the family as aggressive, uncooperative, even dangerous. The boy's confusion morphs into frustration. He knows the truth. He was there. He saw everything. And what he's hearing now isn't just wrong. It's a lie. The room feels like it's shrinking, the walls closing in around the family, suffocating them with every false word the officer utters. The boy's chest tightens, his heart pounding in his small ribcage. His parents' silence, though necessary for their safety, feels unbearable to him. His mother's lessons echo in his mind. Always tell the truth, even when it's hard. And then he can't hold it in any longer. That's not what happened. You're lying. The words tumble out louder than he intended, slicing through the tense air like a blade. The room freezes. Conversations halt mid-sentence, the background noise of the station fading into deafening silence. The officer's face shifts from smug arrogance to stunned disbelief, his mouth slightly open as he processes the fact that a child, a 6-year-old, just called him out. All eyes are on the boy now. His knees feel weak, his heart races, but he stands firm. His voice, though small, carries the weight of undeniable truth. The officer's eyes narrow, a flash of anger flickering beneath his controlled expression. He steps closer, looming over the boy, trying to reclaim his authority through sheer presence. But the boy doesn't back down. "You scared my family. You said things that aren't true. I saw everything." His words are simple, unpolished, but they hit harder than any legal argument. They carry the raw, unfiltered honesty that only a child can deliver, untainted by fear of consequence, driven purely by the need to set things right. The officer stumbles for a response, his usual tactics of intimidation ineffective against someone too young to understand or care about the unspoken rules of power dynamics. The other officers shift uncomfortably, some glancing away, others watching with wide-eyed disbelief. They're witnessing something rare: the collapse of manufactured authority under the weight of unvarnished truth. The boy's father reaches out instinctively, placing a protective hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm but filled with silent pride. The mother's eyes well with tears, not just from fear, but from the overwhelming emotion of seeing her child embody the very courage she's tried to instill. The silence stretches, thick and suffocating, until it's broken, not by the officer, but by the undeniable shift in the room. What was once a space dominated by unquestioned authority is now filled with an invisible force stronger than any badge: the power of truth spoken without fear. The boy's words linger in the air, echoing through the station's sterile halls, refusing to be ignored. And in that moment, the balance shifts. The words hang in the air, a fragile echo that feels louder than the commotion that filled the station just moments before. "You're lying," the boy had said, his voice trembling yet firm, shattering the carefully constructed illusion of authority that the officer wore like a shield. The sound of his small voice reverberates through the room, unsettling something far deeper than mere conversation. It taps into the walls themselves, into the cracks of a system built to withstand scrutiny, until now. The officer, whose confidence had been carved from years of unchecked power, stiffens. His face tightens, a flicker of something crossing his features: anger, embarrassment, fear. For the first time, the uniform feels like nothing more than fabric stitched together, failing to hold the weight of his unraveling facade. His authority isn't reinforced by the badge gleaming on his chest anymore. It's questioned, dissected, and exposed by the raw truth spoken by a child too young to understand the politics of fear. Across the room, officers exchange glances, not the casual nods of routine acknowledgement, but furtive, uncomfortable looks. Some shift their stance, their posture betraying the inner turmoil they've learned to suppress. The boy's words act as a mirror, reflecting not just the officer's misconduct, but the silent complicity of those who've stood by, letting such behavior pass unchecked. No paperwork to hide behind, no procedural jargon to dilute the clarity of what's just been spoken. One officer, older, with lines etched deep into his face from years on the force, crosses his arms but avoids making eye contact with anyone. His jaw clenches as if holding back a truth he's never dared to voice. Another young recruit, fresh to the department, swallows hard, his expression betraying both admiration for the boy's courage and shame for his own silence. The officer tries to reclaim control, his voice rising defensively. "You don't know what you're talking about, kid." But the words sound hollow, brittle, like glass on the verge of shattering. His tone, once dripping with authority, now carries a sharp edge of desperation. He gestures broadly, as if hoping the movement will distract from the tremor in his voice. But it's too late. The spell is broken. The boy doesn't flinch. His small frame stands grounded by a truth larger than the room itself. "I know what I saw," he says softly, not with the defiance of rebellion, but with the simple certainty of someone who's witnessed right from wrong. His eyes, clear, unclouded by the biases that adults carry, lock onto the officers, and in that gaze lies an unspoken challenge. Face what you've done. The officer's bravado crumbles further. He stammers, attempting to redirect the narrative, grasping for control like sand slipping through clenched fists. "This is a misunderstanding," he mutters, voice cracking under the weight of exposure. But no one moves to support him. The silence from his colleagues is deafening, louder than any accusation could ever be. It's not just the boy's words that have shifted the room. It's the undeniable truth behind them. A truth so pure, so unfiltered, that it pierces through the layers of protocol, prejudice, and pretense. It forces every person present to confront the uncomfortable reality. How many times have they ignored a truth because it was easier than facing it? A sergeant, standing in the corner, steps forward, his expression grave. His eyes meet the boy's for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement of the courage it took to speak up. Then he turns to the officer, his voice steady but stripped of the camaraderie that had once shielded misconduct. "We need to talk," he says, signaling the beginning of a reckoning long overdue. The boy's mother moves to his side, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, her touch a mixture of pride and protection. His father stands taller, his earlier silence transformed from fear into quiet strength, fortified by the bravery of his son. They don't need to say anything. The boy has spoken for all of them. The room begins to stir again, but nothing feels the same. The walls that once seemed impenetrable now feel thinner, as if the truth has seeped into every corner, leaving no space untouched. The officers disperse, some retreating into paperwork, others pretending to resume tasks, but their faces betray them. The boy's words linger, etched into the fabric of the station, impossible to file away or forget. Because once the truth is spoken out loud, it cannot be unheard. And in that truth, the foundations of silence begin to crack. The silence that once hung heavy in the police station finally shatters, not with the force of authority, but with the fragile, undeniable truth spoken by a 6-year-old boy. The murmurs begin softly, whispers exchanged between officers who just moments ago had stood frozen in disbelief. The senior officer, a man weathered by years of service and burdened by the unspoken codes of loyalty, steps forward. His uniform, crisp and commanding, seems almost too rigid now, as if struggling to contain the gravity of what has unfolded. He approaches the boy's family, his footsteps echoing louder than the subdued voices around him. There's a pause, a brief hesitation, as if even he is unsure how to confront the rawness of the moment. His gaze shifts from the boy's wide, steady eyes to the officer whose authority has just been dismantled, not by protocol or procedure, but by the courage of a child too young to understand the power structures he just disrupted. Clearing his throat, the senior officer speaks, not with the defensive tone of someone protecting the institution, but with the careful, measured words of a man realizing the institution has failed. "We will be looking into this," he says quietly, but there's a weight to his words, heavier than routine assurances. This isn't just another formality. The boy's voice has turned what would have been swept aside into an undeniable reckoning. An internal investigation is launched, not triggered by the usual cascade of reports and red tape, but by the piercing clarity of a single truth. The process unfolds quickly, driven not by the system's efficiency, but by the urgency of public scrutiny. Word spreads beyond the station walls, carried by the ripple effect of the boy's bravery. Community members, local leaders, and eventually the media pick up the story, not because it's sensational, but because it's too human to ignore. A child standing up against a system designed to intimidate. The officer at the center of it all faces suspension. His badge, once a symbol of unquestioned power, now lies under a microscope, scrutinized, examined, and stripped of the immunity it once provided. For the first time, he's not the one asking the questions. The arrogance that once laced his words has evaporated, replaced by the hollow realization that accountability, long evaded, has finally found him in the most unexpected way. The boy's family, though still trembling from the emotional aftermath, begins to find their footing. Their fear hasn't vanished, but it's been replaced with something sturdier: pride, resilience, and the unshakable knowledge that their truth was heard. The father, who had clenched his fists in silent frustration earlier, now holds his son's hand with a different kind of grip, not one of protection, but of gratitude. The mother's tears, once born of fear, now carry a different story, one of triumph, of a voice that refused to be silenced even when the room demanded it. The community watches, their own experiences reflected in the boy's simple words. His courage becomes a beacon, illuminating not just the darkness of that one officer's actions, but the shadows cast by years of unchecked behavior. People who had grown accustomed to staying silent begin to speak out. Neighbors recalling their own encounters, officers questioning the culture they've been part of, and leaders facing demands they can no longer ignore. The boy himself doesn't fully grasp the magnitude of what he's done. He's just 6 years old, after all. But he feels it in the way people look at him differently now, not with pity or dismissal, but with respect. He doesn't wear a badge, but in that moment, he embodies the very ideals those badges are supposed to represent: courage, integrity, and justice. In the days that follow, reforms are discussed within the department. Training programs that once felt like checkbox exercises take on new meaning. Policies are reviewed, accountability measures strengthened, not because of pressure from legal advisors or political figures, but because a child reminded everyone what justice truly sounds like. And the boy? He returns to his childhood, playing with friends, going to school, living the life of a kid who once stood taller than men twice his size. But the echoes of his words remain etched in the walls of that police station, a permanent reminder that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room doesn't come from authority, but from the unwavering honesty of a child who simply refused to be quiet. His story becomes more than an incident. It becomes a lesson, a testament to the power of truth, the courage to speak it, and the undeniable fact that even the smallest voices can create the loudest echoes. The boy's words did not end at the sterile walls of the police station. They traveled like a ripple across still water, expanding with each retelling. In the days that followed, his simple act of courage grew into something far greater than a single moment of defiance. It became a beacon. The story found its way onto community bulletins, whispered conversations in grocery stores, and eventually the headlines of local news outlets. 6-year-old exposes injustice, the captions read. But beneath the bold print was a quieter message. one that resonated with the hearts of people who had long felt invisible, unheard, and powerless. The boy's words didn't carry the authority of a badge or the weight of legal jargon. They carried something more profound: unfiltered truth. It was the kind of truth that didn't require validation because it came from a place untouched by the fear that often silences adults. His voice, trembling yet steady, held a mirror to a system designed to intimidate and suppress. And that mirror didn't just reflect one officer's misconduct. It reflected the complacency of those who had watched in silence for too long. Communities that had grown weary of fighting battles they thought they couldn't win found a renewed sense of purpose. Town hall meetings grew fuller, not with angry mobs, but with determined faces, neighbors, parents, and even former skeptics, all inspired by the idea that change could begin with a whisper of truth. People who had never spoken out before now stood behind podiums, sharing their own stories of injustice, emboldened by the knowledge that if a child could find his voice, so could they. The media tried to capture the essence of the story, but it was more than just headlines and sound bites. It was in the tearful embrace of a mother who realized her son had done what generations before him had been too afraid to do. It was in the silent nods exchanged between strangers who recognized the courage it took to speak out when silence felt safer. The officer's name faded into the background, as names often do. But the boy's legacy didn't need a name to endure. It lived in the shift of awareness, in the questions now being asked within precincts and city councils, in the uncomfortable yet necessary conversations happening around dinner tables. His truth had done what countless reports and protests struggled to achieve. It pierced through apathy and forced people to confront what they'd chosen to ignore. For the boy, life slowly returned to its simple rhythms: school, playgrounds, and bedtime stories. But there was a subtle change, not just in him, but in the way the world responded to him. Teachers listened more attentively. Strangers smiled with a knowing warmth, and his parents held him just a little closer, proud not just of what he had done, but of who he was becoming. The story doesn't end with a dramatic courtroom scene or sweeping legislative reform. It ends, or rather continues, with the understanding that courage isn't always loud. It doesn't always wear a cape or come with applause. Sometimes it's as quiet as a child's voice cutting through the noise, refusing to be ignored. And maybe that's the lesson we carry forward, that the smallest voices often hold the biggest truths, that justice doesn't always roar. It sometimes speaks softly, in trembling words, in shaky breaths, in moments where fear is present but not powerful enough to silence the truth. So, as we reflect on this story, we're reminded that courage isn't about the absence of fear. It's about speaking anyway. It's about standing when your knees tremble. It's about knowing that even if your voice shakes, what you say still matters. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of truth, of the courage that lives within all of us, then let's keep this conversation going. Let's amplify the voices that need to be heard. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope, justice, and the quiet courage that changes the world, one voice at a time. Because sometimes all it takes is one small voice to make the biggest difference.